Iklim Inspirasi Inforia Islami. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum to all Iklim radio listeners who are currently tuning in to Open Forum on this Sunday evening. And thank you once again for being with us for another episode of Open Forum. And Alhamdulillah, today we have with us on the program, we have Dr. Muhammad Sheikh Saifuddin Sheikh Muhammad Saleh. He's the director for the Center of Science and Environment Studies, IKIM. Assalamualaikum, Doctor.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for being on Open Forum this week. And how are you doing?
I'm good, Alhamdulillah. How are you today?
Alhamdulillah, Doctor. And inshallah, I believe that we'll be discussing about a very interesting topic, which is very relevant to the society today, to the challenges faced by the society today especially. And our topic for discussion, Doctor, we're going to talk about gender and gender identity, the nature versus nurture debate. And I think this particular topic is very much relevant in terms of on so many aspects. And recently we can see that this debate or this issue is being raised in the Olympics, Doctor, about the issue of gender identity. And we also see that there is a human rights movement, especially an activism that focus on the issues based on the rights to gender identity. So when we talk about, when I mentioned about what happened during the Olympics, where male athletes who underwent sexual and gender identity change, competing in sports categories exclusively set for female athletes. So this has raised concern and actually invited criticism leverage against the International Olympics Committee and Council for allowing so-called former male athletes to compete in these categories. And there are also other issues here, Doctor, being raised about this, how schools are being sued by students who did not agree about the usage of toilet facilities, to people who does not belong in their actual gender group. So this has raised many concerns in societies, not just being discussed or being raised in Malaysian context, but also internationally and globally, Doctor. So my first question with regard to this topic, if you may share with our listeners, can you please define the term gender identity, and also sexual orientation of individuals, Doctor?
Right. Thank you, Puan Yani Zahura. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to all our listeners. As rightly mentioned by Puan Yani just now, the topic that we are discussing is actually of very much interest to everyone. It is very relevant and at the same time very controversial, as well as very complex. So the focus for our discussion today, at least the way I approach the topic, will very much be from the scientific perspective, as well as the Islamic perspective. I will not delve into other aspects such as the human rights debate, because I think if we were to go into that, our discussion will be very long. The time given for this program will not be sufficient. So going to your question with regards to the definition of gender identity and sexual orientation, I think first and foremost, I think we need to understand that the area of human sexuality is especially complex. And many clinical reports include glossaries of definitions which seek to promote clarity about vocabulary and terminology pertaining to human sexuality. If you were to look at the vocabulary and terminology associated with human sexuality from the perspective of science, we have to first understand that science proceeds by way of defining terms and concepts that are agreeable to empirical research. Now, having said that, science also receives terms from common discourse, which then need to be contextualized scientifically in order to enable research to be undertaken. Scientific terms are not necessarily the same as those that are used in ordinary conversation. or that people would prefer to use in reference to themselves. Any review of scientific research on sexual orientation, therefore, needs to begin with clarity of terminology. So, in our discussion today, the term gender primarily refers to the social roles associated with male or female, or other gender identity that some may wish to promote. Gender is construed differently in different social and cultural contexts.
Okay.
Gender identity is therefore socially and culturally situated. In fact, we find that concepts such as homosexuality are also understood differently in different cultures, or else are not recognized at all in some cultures. And thus, sexual identity, defined on the basis of sexual orientation, is also to be understood in social and cultural contexts. Uh, if you were to look at sexual orientation, it basically refers to the predominant focus of sexual attraction. Sexual orientation is usually construed in terms of attraction to the same or opposite sex or both, and thus as homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual, respectively. As an alternative approach, some researchers interpret sexual orientation in terms of attraction to male or female. Thus, they use the terms androphilic or gynephilic, respectively, without actually referring to the gender of the person experiencing the attraction.
Okay.
Uh, I would also like to stress at this particular point that there are currently no agreed upon definitions of sexual orientation among scholars and researchers for purposes of empirical research. So, even by looking at the definitions, we see that it's quite a complex issue. To find
Mm.
an agreeable definition is not something that is easy.
Yeah.
And this is part of the challenge when it comes to discussing the issue of gender and gender identity.
So basically, what you have defined, especially what is proven or what is discovered through the scientific process and observed empirically is very much taken into account in giving definitions and also understanding of these terms and adopted, and also this observation. Um, when we're talking about gender identity and also sexual orientation disorders, there is this nature versus nurture debate,
Yeah.
and this is the debate has been taking place in in mainstream discussions for such a long time, since the word terms like LGBT and things like that come into focus or come into existence in academic discussion. So what is this nature versus nurture debate, Doctor, in the issue regarding gender identity and sexual orientation? And if you may share with our listeners as well, what are some of the factors that support this nature argument?
Right, thank you, Paneni. I think debates on sexual orientation and gender identity, whether they are born this way, which is attributed to nature, or
Mm-hmm.
whether they are, or if they are influenced by the surrounding and environment, in other words, attributed to nurture,
Mm-hmm.
has been going on for many decades. Like you said, we can trace this back to, if we're talking about scientific evidence to support the argument, we can trace this back to the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
Argument for being born this way brings forth the idea that sexual orientation and gender identity is innate. That is, a person is already homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual since before they were born.
Mm-hmm.
As such, based on this argument, this is an important characteristic of an individual that cannot be changed or be influenced by other people or the
Mm-hmm.
surrounding or the
Yeah.
environment that he or she encounters.
Yeah.
And according to the logic of this argument, because sexual orientation and gender identity is innate and not a choice,
Mm-hmm.
therefore homosexuality and bisexuality are relationships that are normal and natural and should
Mm-hmm.
be accepted by such as such by society. And they basically use a number of biological factors to support the born this way argument. To list down in detail may not be possible due to time constraint, but I will try to summarize the factors. The four main factors are: number one is brain structure, secondly, prenatal hormones, the third is genetics, and the fourth is fraternal birth order effect. Let's look at the first one,
Mm-hmm.
which is the brain structure. Simply put, there are differences between the male and female brains, and that if a man is born with a brain similar to a woman, the argument is simply put, he could be a homosexual. That is one argument that is usually used.
Mhm.
There have been researches conducted on animals such as sheep and mice that showed gender-based differences of the brain, specifically at the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. Sexually dimorphic nucleus is an ovoid, densely packed cluster of large cells located in the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus of the brain, and this particular area is believed to be related to sexual behaviors in animals. When we look at a research published in 2004 by a group of researchers led by Rosselli, they found that the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area is the mediator to mating behaviors of animals like sheep based on sexual dimorphic characteristics. Sexual dimorphic characteristics refer to the difference between the appearance of a male and a female aside from reproductive organs, and this includes color, size, shape, as well as structure, which is also actually related to genetics.
Mhm.
And then we have an earlier study, a controversial study published way back in 1991 by Levay, that found that there is a difference in size and number of cells in the hypothalamus of the brain between a heterosexual man and a homosexual man. Specifically, the difference was found at the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. However, it has been noted that attempts to replicate the study by Levay has not been successful. In fact, an author, Christopher Cook, in a very recent publication in 2021, the publication is entitled The Causes of Human Sexual Orientation, outrightly pointed out that the research conducted by Levay used a very small sample and could not be replicated in other studies. Now, that's the first factor that is often used as the basis for the argument for born this way. The
Mhm.
second argument used to support the born this way argument is prenatal hormones. Prenatal hormones have always been used as the main determinant, but at the very least as a co-determinant of sexual orientation. The argument is that exposure of prenatal hormones, androgen, to the fetal brain during pregnancy influences sexual orientation. This, according to various researchers, can be manifested in physical characteristics. For example, in the ratio of the length of the second digit, which is the index finger, divided by the length of the fourth digit, which is the ring finger, is affected by prenatal androgens in humans.
Mhm.
This ratio is greater in females than males from fetal life through adulthood, correlates with polymorphism in the androgen receptor gene in men, is masculinized in congenital adrenal hypoplasia, which is a genetic disorder that affects the adrenal glands, and is feminine in XY androgen insensitivity syndrome, whereby a person who is genetically male, who has one X and one Y chromosome, is resistant to male hormones called androgens, and
Mhm.
as a result, the person has some of the physical traits of a woman, but the genetic makeup of a man. However, the problem with studying hormonal influence is that there are obvious ethical limitations to carry out studies, especially on fetus. From the
Mhm.
perspective of science, a fetus exposure to high androgen, especially testosterone, during critical period in pregnancy brings about the development of male sexual characteristics. However, there are not enough evidence to say whether or not these sexual characteristics, which are developed during pregnancy, have a causal relationship with sexual orientation. At best, the argument based on prenatal hormones are still hypothetical. The third argument is based on genetics. There have been studies looking at identical twins or monozygotic twins who have 100% similarity when it comes to their genetic material compared to fraternal twins or dizygotic twins who share 50% of their genetic material. Early researchers show that genetics seems to be a factor that influences sexual orientation, with a high concordance rate of about 52% for monozygotic or identical twins. However, when this research is replicated using a better sampling procedure, the concordance rate drops to 24%, highlighting that the conclusion for using genetics as a scientific basis for born this way argument is not strong enough. In conducting genetic linkage studies involving homosexual brothers, a research published in 1993 by a group led by Dean Hamer found that the section on the X chromosome, specifically XQ28, is identified to be related to homosexuality orientation in men. However, when others tried to replicate this study, the results were varied.
Mm-hmm.
One research found that the result was not significant. Another
Okay.
research concluded that there was no proof that a homosexual gene exists. Yet another found that there was no relationship between XQ28 and homosexuality, while another research stressed that homosexuality is not dependent on one particular gene. And
Mm-hmm.
these varied results cast doubt on the argument regarding the homosexuality gene. The fourth argument involves the fraternal birth order effect, which was first attributed as a factor of male homosexuality in a 1992 study by Blanchard and Sheridan. In
Mm-hmm.
essence, the fraternal birth order effect is the finding that older brothers increase the probability of homosexuality in later born males.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do a meta-analysis study, this can be confirmed, but confirmed that there is a relationship between fraternal birth order effect and male sexual orientation. But the relationship is not strong enough and cannot be used as a generalization across time and society. So these are the four factors that have
Mm-hmm.
been used as biological arguments to support the born this way hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And Again, even though these arguments have been brought forth by proponents, we
Mm-hmm.
find that the arguments can also be scientifically debunked or
Mm-hmm.
rejected.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you have explained interestingly about how there are other scientists as well actually who gave different evidence to what the factors that have been used to support the born this way argument, as you have said, and being someone or being individuals, especially in the setting of Muslim society, Doctor, we're talking about this. How does Islam explain the argument that gender identity and human sexual orientation disorders are natural biological qualities of individuals? I mean, as Muslims and coming from especially mainstream Muslim societies, have explained and also have provide arguments. But then, if we can actually explain what is the actual Islamic explanation to this, Doctor, if you may share with our listeners with regard to this.
Thank you, Pioneer. I think this is, I will respond from my own point of view. I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the challenges when we talk about scientific evidence, it is very difficult for others to refute scientific evidences. So if
Yeah.
proponents of what this way argument brings forth all these scientific so-called evidences,
Mm-hmm.
most of us would likely have difficulties in challenging their arguments.
Yeah.
But I think I would like to highlight something. That is, in Islam, there are two very important terms that are often confused with one another.
Mm-hmm.
The first is tabi'i, and the other is fitrah.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think most of us tend to use these two terms interchangeably as if they were the
Mm-hmm.
same.
Yeah.
They may be similar, but not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm.
Tabi'i, in the context of our discussion, tabi'i is in essence a person's biological characteristic
Okay.
as well as genetic makeup. Fitrah, on the other hand, is the ideal state that Islam stresses upon that we need to achieve. What
Mm-hmm.
conforms to fitrah does not necessarily refer to the natural, biological, or tabi'i state of a person, whether during pregnancy or after birth.
Mm-hmm.
Fitrah in Islam includes efforts to achieve the objective of the creation of man, which more often than not requires us to make changes and adjustments as well as sacrifices to change from our natural, biological, or tabi'i state to reach that ideal state of fitrah. One simple example that we undergo every year is
Mm-hmm.
fasting during the month of Ramadan.
Yeah.
The action that conforms to tabi'i or biological or natural state of a human being, when we are hungry, we have to eat.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the month of Ramadan, in order to attain fitrah, Muslims have been instructed to refrain from eating as well as drinking
Mm-hmm.
during the day, even though when we are hungry and thirsty.
Yeah.
During the month of Ramadan, we try to attain the ideal state of fitrah as ordained by Islam through the act of refraining from eating and drinking, which does not correlate to our natural disposition.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
is why we celebrate Eid al-Fitr
Mm-hmm.
at the end of Ramadan as a sign that we have achieved the state of fitrah as ordained by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, there is a very famous hadith that I'm sure many of us are familiar with from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam,
So much.
which is narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu an, that states that five practices are characteristics of fitrah:
Mm-hmm.
circumcision, shaving the pubic region,
Mm-hmm.
plucking out hair under the armpit,
Mm-hmm.
clipping the nails, and cutting the mustache short. Now,
Mm-hmm.
all these five practices to achieve the state of fitrah, as mentioned in the hadith, requires physical changes to the natural or tabi'i state of a human being from the biological point of view.
Mm-hmm.
However, the act of changing something that is natural or biological or tabi'i to attain the state of fitrah is something that brings forth benefits from the perspective of Islam. As such, even if later on there are concrete scientific evidences that gender and gender orientation as well as sexual orientation are biologically linked, it is still a necessity for all of us to strive to attain fitrah as ordained by Islam. Most
Mm-hmm.
definitely, homosexuality is against the teaching of Islam. From
Yeah.
this point of view, it is our responsibility to ensure that we do not do anything that is against our religious belief and teaching,
Mm-hmm.
even if we feel that such act is part of our nature. What
Mm-hmm.
is natural or biological or tabi'i may not necessarily be fitrah from the perspective of Sharia. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
probably my response to your
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I think what you have mentioned basically about understanding the fitrah is very important with regard to, you making sure that you achieve that ideal state. As you have said, fitrah is about efforts, especially in achieving the ideal state of human creation. And when you talked about, the arguments, for example, the brain structure, the prenatal hormones, the genetics, and also the fraternal birth order effect that you have mentioned before. I think as Muslims, we have to understand that in all of this, there is this essence of fitrah in this aspect as well, yeah, doctor, that we need to make sure that we, take into account our efforts in making sure that we do not try to use this as an excuse to what is there in our condition, in our, especially when it comes to biological aspect. Doctor, we've talked about how there is this nature versus nurture debate with regard to gender and gender identity, where you mentioned that nature is actually about what is there, what is biological or innate, you're born with, and nurture is something which is what your surrounding or your environment contribute to how you develop yourself as an individual. So, and this, as we have said earlier, this has been also the arguments, academic discussion that is being central to, in many activism with regard to this gender and gender identity issue. So, Doctor, maybe as a conclusion to our discussion today, what can you actually summarize this discussion, Doctor?
Right, thank you, Paneni. I think as a conclusion, I would like to highlight the following three major points from our
Mm-hmm.
discussion this afternoon.
Yeah.
Number one, the understanding of sexual orientation as an innate, biologically fixed property of human beings, that is, the
Mm-hmm.
idea that people are born this way, is not supported by scientific evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, the idea that gender identity is innate, fixed property of human beings that is independent of biological sex, that a person might be a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman
Mm-hmm.
trapped in a man's body is also not supported by scientific evidence. That's point number
Mm-hmm.
one.
Yeah.
Point number two, while there is evidence that biological factors such as genes and hormones are associated with sexual behaviors and attractions, there are
Mm-hmm.
no compelling causal biological explanations for human sexual orientation. While minor differences in the brain structures and brain activity between homosexual and heterosexual individuals have been identified by researchers, such neurological findings do not demonstrate whether these differences are innate or are the result of environmental and psychological factors. That's point
Mm-hmm.
number two.
Yeah.
Point number three, even if one wants to use the born this way argument, it must be emphasized again that what is natural or biological or tabi'i may not necessarily conform to what is fitrah in Islam. It is
Mm-hmm.
our duty as Muslims to strive to achieve the ideal state of fitrah in order to attain Allah's blessings. In
Mm-hmm.
many instances, to achieve the state of fitrah requires us to make changes to what we consider to be natural to us. It is
Mm-hmm.
easy to blame the way we were born, and to make changes is definitely not easy, and in fact requires a lot of effort and sacrifice. But
Mm-hmm.
if our aim in life is to be successful in this world and the hereafter, then this
Mm-hmm.
is something that cannot be avoided. I think these are
Mm-hmm.
three major points that I'd like to highlight as a conclusion to this discussion, which I think is very relevant. But again,
Mm-hmm.
there are many angles and dimensions to this discussion, and what we have touched on today is primarily from the scientific angle.
Mm-hmm. Right, Dr. Sheikh, I think you've highlighted, or in your conclusion, you've highlighted the aspect of how we as human beings must focus on what is fitrah of us, then looking at other aspect that can actually help us in terms of understanding this. Doctor, thank you again for accepting our invitation to be on Open Forum this week, and you have explained in length, and also with regard to this, what is nature argument with regard to the issue of gender and gender identity. And inshallah, Doctor, will invite you again to Open Forum to discuss on other issues as well, especially on Islamic perspective on certain issues that are relevant in our society today, Doctor. And thank you to my producer, Haja Mazrina Ismail, and also to our digital technology team who's assisting us with this. And do you tune in again to Open Forum next week on Sunday at 5:15 p.m. And with that, thank you, Doctor. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.